Welcome back to Combat Mission Battle for Normandy. This is a huge scale meeting engagement and I've got a specially reinforced American armoured infantry platoon rushing down this road in their half-tracks as fast as possible. Out in front, I've got a pair of jeeps from the battalion recon platoon. One of these turns off halfway up and drives into a ditch to act as a listening post. The other reaches the end of the straight and goes off-road, cutting across the fields to get into the village of Saint-Contest up ahead. On their right, in the gap between Saint-Contest and the objective village of Buron, the scouts spot a Kübelwagen going the other way. That's not a problem for the scouts though. Following them up and almost as fast, an M18 Hellcat rolls around the corner and blows the Germans away with a 76mm AP shell. First blood to me, but there's a Panther right behind the Kübelwagen bearing down on the M18. The Panther gets the first shot off, but it's an unsteady platform on the move and misses high. The Hellcat replies by putting a shot into the centre of the Panther's front slope, but it bounces off. Machine gun fire goes both ways as the crews force each other to button up. The Panther somehow misses again, low this time, and the Hellcat scores a hit just under the gun mantlet that doesn't penetrate but does cause spalling to zip around inside the turret. The Panther rolls to a stop. Then the long 75 swings round and fires, putting a shell straight through the thin frontal armour of the Hellcat and out the back, wiping out the crew and annihilating the little tank destroyer in a single catastrophic hit. Is facing down a charging Panther with an M18 Hellcat a good idea? No. It's not impossible for the Hellcat to take the Panther out from the front, especially at this kind of short range, but it has a very slim chance of success, and making decisions based on a very slim chance of success is by definition unlikely to end well. So why am I doing that, instead of throwing the M18 into reverse and praying it gets away? Because there's an entire armoured infantry team behind it around that corner, and if the Panther catches them, then I've got serious problems. I can afford to lose the Hellcat. I can't afford to lose my infantry. The Hellcat has to die to buy me time to get into position. Next in line behind the tank destroyer is a Stuart fitted with a hedge cutter which has already swung off-road by the time the Panther has appeared. While the Hellcat makes its stand, the little Stuart rips through a chunk of bocage into the adjacent field and the half-tracks plunge in after it into relative safety. Not prepared to dismiss a potential flanking shot on a Panther, I rush the Stuart over to the far side where it scores 2 hits in quick succession. The 37mm AP projectiles bounce off without doing any damage, but the German tank is already reversing off. This first little engagement really highlights a key theme in this battle. Sometimes the big picture forces you into bad options. Speaking of the big picture, what's actually going on here? We're fighting over a slightly altered chunk of the Caen map project, specifically a 3700 by 1700 metre area around the village of Buron in August 1944. This is a quick battle. It's not historically accurate. Buron is near Caen in the British sector, so my American troops are a bit lost, and the village was taken by Canadian troops in early July, but it's interesting to see US forces fighting in this area. I have tweaked the contours a little so that the deployment zones at either end are the same height, putting Buron itself on a central ridgeline. I'm starting in the west, with the edge of Grouchy on my right, and the Germans under my good friend General Sir Anthony C.H. Melchett are starting in the east, with the edge of Saint-Contest on their right. General has kicked my ass repeatedly in combat mission, and combining the size of the map, the terrain, and the size of the forces involved means that there are a lot of ways this battle could pan out. Obviously what I want to do is tailor my force and my planning to try and make sure the battle pans out in a way that works for me. Meeting engagements are all about picking your fights, and one of the important parts of that is getting to where you want to be firstest with mostest. I think going up against German armour in the surrounding open fields is a recipe for disaster. I'm expecting panthers, and panthers will eat Germans for breakfast if they can get into long-range frontal engagements. So where I want to be for this battle is in the village of Buron itself. Short ranges, flanking opportunities, and close infantry support should tip the balance in my favour. So fighting inside the village is good, but seizing the village first and forcing the enemy to attack it is even better. This is why 2nd Armoured Infantry Platoon has bum-rushed up the left and broken into Buron at the far end. From up there they can act as a tripwire, giving me early warning of any incoming Germans and hopefully slowing them down long enough for the rest of my force to reach Buron and get set up. Running parallel to 2nd Platoon, another jeep from the Battalion Recon Platoon has raced up Main Street and grabbed the attic of this house, so I can see if anything comes this way. They've scrounged a bazooka from the Recon Platoon half-track in case they encounter an armoured nasty, but just after the Hellcat has been taken out, they gun down a German scout trying to get in through the front door. 3 more make it inside though, bringing with them a radio and a Panzerfaust, and taking a position on the ground floor. 2nd Platoon is close by, the platoon HQ rolls up and dismounts in the same turn, but I've got bigger problems. Most of 2nd Platoon is heading towards the Scouts' house to clear any Germans out of the immediate area, and generally infest the side of the road and the orchards in case more rush in. But the platoon machine gun section has moved up to the far corner of the outer field alongside the Stuart to get eyes on the open ground at the end of the village. Even as they're getting into position, the MG section HQ spots a German half-track coming in. If the troops inside can force me off the corner, then I'll have lost an important set of eyes. Worse, it looks like they've brought a Panzerschreck with them, and they'll have a perfect flanking shot through the Bocage on the Stuart. I might have made a mistake sending the rest of the platoon to support the scouts. The MG section is on its own here. The section leader fires off a rifle grenade that misses. Then a second half-track appears and my men suddenly have 24 Germans piling out of their 251s right ahead of them as they frantically try and set their M1919 machine gun up. Right behind them though is their M3A1, which lets rip with the 50 at point blank range. Hand grenades go both ways, killing a man in the section HQ and pinning it, but the section B team gets online further down the Bocage and adds a new source of small arms fire. The 50 rinses one of the half-tracks, killing the driver, and then suddenly the crisis point is past. The passengers of the knocked-out German half-track are either all out of action or fleeing. The surviving half-track is trying to pull away and its passengers are pinned down just in front of the MG section HQ, which has now recovered from the stick grenade that came their way and opened up with their machine gun. It's not all one way. As the lone survivor of the German platoon HQ falls back, he pauses to lob another potato masher over the Bocage, which goes off on the front of the M3, damaging the wheels and prompting the half-track to reverse away, as well as wiping out the MG section leader and his machine gunner. But by now the B team has gotten their M1919 set up, and a diverted squad of infantry rolls up in another M3A1 half-track to reinforce the position. They're just in time to help mop up, half of them squeezing through a gap in the Bocage to enter the wood next door and enfilade the corner position. They bring a bazooka with them and spot the remaining half-track as it tries to turn away, but the rocket goes high and it crawls out of danger on damaged tracks. Meanwhile, the rest of 2nd Platoon has managed to take out the Germans in the Scouts' house, and although for a moment it looks like a Panther might be coming to pay them a visit, it backs off after the shootout on half-track corner. Without infantry support, the Panther will be very vulnerable with bazooka-armed GIs trying to get at its side, rear or top armour, which of course is exactly what I want to do. It did get a good view down Main Street though, and if I had had any forces using that road, they could have gotten a rude 75mm high-velocity surprise. But I don't. One of the reasons why I might need 2nd Platoon up at the front of the village to slow General down is that it's going to take some time to get the rest of my infantry into position. Using the main road would be fast, but it's also an angle that I know the Germans can cover before I can deploy, which is why it's not currently full of targets for the Panther. Instead, 3rd Platoon has switched off the main road to the right side of the village. This might be safer, but it does take longer. A fact not helped when one of the half-tracks briefly gets bogged on the track. So instead of rushing to the far end of Buron and running the risk of bumping into encroaching enemy forces, the platoon is swinging left into this orchard. From here, in central Buron, they can cover both of the roads leading into the village from the German side of the map, and switch between them very easily. So if the enemy does get past 2nd platoon, 3rd platoon will be waiting for them. Luckily though, the triple action up on the left with the Hellcat, Scout's House and half-track corner seem to have convinced General that I've gotten into the village firstest with mostest. We've fought each other enough times for General to suspect that I've prepared the ground at his end of the village, which he is entirely correct about. I'm anticipating heavy fighting here, so there are 2 target reference points ahead of 3rd platoon, ready for the off-map 2-gun 105mm priest section I have on standby. It would be nice if I could sucker General into Buron and smash him with the artillery, but he's too smart to fall for that. Instead, it looks like the German main effort might be on my right, which is a lot more worrying. The map isn't perfectly symmetrical. Saint-Contest is poorly served by the road network, and forms both an obstruction to movement and observation from east to west, and one side of a choke point restricting access to the open ground on my left flank. Both factors I've exploited by rushing 2nd platoon up. Grouchy is considerably less obstructive, and there really is nothing between me and the enemy except the gentle contours of the central ridge. This is tank country, exactly the kind of ground I want to avoid. But I still need to see what's going on there. I'm purposefully holding back my armour so I can send it to where it's needed. So off goes another small convoy on the first turn. In the lead are the last 2 jeeps of the battalion recon platoon. The trailing vehicle pulls a hard right as it exits Grouchy and breaks into a field to set up an observation post. It's followed up by a truck towing one of the armoured infantry company's 57mm AT guns, which will set up in the same hedgerow. The jeep in front keeps going though, taking advantage of the paved road to rush up over the central ridge. Swerving off-road into a wheat field, the plan is to ditch the jeep and hide the scouts in the crops. They're already spotting things as they pile out. There are German flak wagons on the far map edge. The General has seen the jeep and immediately engages it with the flak as the scouts bail and leg it into the wheat. A quad 20mm flak cannon firing at you is not a pleasant experience. The range is long, about 1800 meters, meaning that the flak takes a few bursts to get on target. This is good news for the scouts, who can put more distance between them and the target, but bad news for Grouchy when a burst of 20mm overshoots the ridge and falls into the village 2,800 meters away from the flak. It's quite disturbing to see high explosive cannon fire dropping in so close to the road. Luckily I don't have anything there that's at risk. But that kind of massive overshoot is an exception, and soon the jeep is shredded. The scouts don't need it to do their job anymore though. As they run from the incoming fire, they spot German armour heading their way. I was certainly expecting to see Panthers, they're bad enough, but I wasn't expecting to see a Jagdpanther. This doesn't have a turret, instead it has much thicker frontal armour and a more powerful 88mm gun. Worse, General has brought 2 of them along. This Panzer Wedge is entirely capable of rolling through almost anything I can throw at it, at least in its frontal arc. Effective armour means they can shrug off anything except lucky hits, while their high velocity guns are not only capable of penetrating Shermans at long range, but also have flatter trajectories, so they're likely to get on target faster. The scouts have at least given me some time to work out how I want to deal with these monsters and position my forces accordingly, but I do have one other trick up my sleeve: the US Army Air Force. I've brought 4 P-47 Thunderbolts along in support. They're not carrying bombs or rockets, that would have been far too expensive, but they do have 8 50 caliber machine guns and 3,400 rounds of ammunition each. They're not going to destroy any tanks, but they can freak out the crews and saturate the external subsystems with a hail of bullets, stripping off radio aerials, breaking periscopes and damaging tracks. Anything that can degrade the performance of enemy armour is a must if you're playing as the Allies. Of course, that makes anti-aircraft assets a must if you're playing as the Germans, and we've already seen part of General's flak contingent. Combat Mission doesn't visually model aircraft, they simply don't spend enough time over the battlefield to be worth the effort, but their locations in the sky are modelled and streams of flak stab up to meet them. Some of the lower trajectory cannon fire again sails worryingly far into my half of the map. One of the P-47s breaks off immediately, intimidated by the flak. The other three evade through, strafing something on the left and a couple of Panthers on the right before catching a Kubelwagen returning from Buron. Then the anti-air fire begins to tell. Two of the planes catch bursts and are shot down, one of them crashing on map and leaving a huge crater over near General's setup zone. In just a couple of minutes, half my air support is gone, and it's going to take at least 11 minutes for my FOs to call the two survivors in again, now that they're leaving the battlefield to gain safety in distance and altitude. At least they got some hits in. We're only 8 minutes in at this point, so 1 hour 52 to go, but in meeting engagements the first clashes so often set up the rest of the game. General and I have had our plans and forces collide. We've got to work out what the situation is and then adapt to it. More specifically for me, I need to figure out what to do with my tanks. I brought most of a Sherman company along. 3 platoons of 5 tanks and the company HQ. These are all wet M4A3s, meaning that they have wet ammunition stowage to reduce the risk of fires, and 2 tanks in each platoon are armed with the more powerful 76mm gun. The Shermans are currently fairly spread out. A and C platoons on the left and right flanks respectively are holding the reverse slopes on either side of the village as insurance against a sudden rush, while B platoon is already moving into Buron itself. The village is going to be key. If that panzer wedge comes up on my right, there are a lot of barrage and keyhole positions in the village from which I can threaten its more vulnerable flanks, so that's ultimately where I want my main tank strength to be. There are 3 things that are going to slow me down on this front though. First, while I'm pretty confident there's no German infantry in the far end of the village, I'm not 100% sure, and the last thing I want to get is a Panzerfaust surprise, so 3rd Platoon Armoured Infantry is going to have to go out and clear it first. Second, I have to actually navigate my tanks through the village. Buron is highly compartmentalised by a mix of high walls, low walls, fences, hedges and barrage, some of which my tanks can knock through, and some of which they can't. I have an ace up my sleeve for this. The Stuart with the hedge cutter has already left half-track corner and switched into the centre, where it's currently bulldozing away through the orchards in the middle of Buron to give me a concealed path. But that is also going to take time, especially as all the barrage busting is steadily damaging the Stuart's tracks. Tied into these navigation issues is the third problem, the enemy. The edge of the village is not a perfect barrier to observation and fire. The closer General's tanks get, and the more angles they open up into Buron, the harder it's going to be to move around without getting spotted and engaged. So I need to be careful. And I mean really careful. As B platoon moves up, I misjudge a move order for its first Sherman 76, tank B1, and it ends up on the slightly higher right bank of the track in a gap between a barn and a farmhouse at the exact moment that General punches 2 Panthers from the panzer wedge forward. The silver lining of this unplanned engagement is that B1 is in as close to perfect a position as it could hope for at this angle. It's hull down behind a wall in a keyhole. It spots one of the Panthers and turns the turret to engage, but the Panther behind the target has already come to a stop and gets a lightning fast shot off. Luckily this goes high, leaving B1 free to engage the lead Panther. While the loader gives it a squirt of 50 cal from the pintle mount to try and button up the German TC, the gunner lays on and actually scores a first round hit, which pancakes on the Panther's front slope. The lead Panther gets its first shot off, followed closely by the trailing Panther's second. Both of these are on target but intercepted by the high walls in front of the Sherman. B1's next shot bounces off the top of the gun mantlet, and then it's all over. The lead Panther puts one shot square into the 76's gun mantlet, killing the commander. The crew go into a panic, but don't seem to realise their tank is totaled, so they're still inside when a follow-up shot hits in the same place, killing the loader and wounding the gunner. They finally bail out and flee into the nearby farmyard, but at least there's some cold comfort in seeing the wet ammunition stowage working. The tank doesn't burn. That engagement probably wouldn't have happened if B1 was only a few meters to the left on this slightly lower track. A lapse in attention to detail means that I'm now down a second tank, while General's armoured strength is not only intact, but greater than I'd imagined. Another Panther has appeared on the left to back up the one that killed the Hellcat, and yet another is out on the far right map edge. Including the 3 in the wedge, that makes 6 in total at least. Plus, of course, the 2 Jagdpanthers. On the plus side, the B1 engagement has proved the General that I have tanks inside Buron, and he now has to take them and the possibility of flanking fire into account. The Panzer Wedge stops and puts some fire into the buildings near the knocked out 76, but it doesn't come much closer. This gives me the time and space I need to properly occupy Buron. I really want to get some tanks into the far right field. The outer edge is tall bocage, which I can not only hide my Shermans behind, but I can man with infantry to keep eyes on the Panzers. Hopefully by exploiting this, I'll have some control over tank engagements. I can initiate or decline them by rolling my armour up to the bocage or reversing away, which is a huge advantage. 15 minutes in, 3rd Platoon have cleared the field out, and I'm starting to get Shermans from B Platoon in there. Better yet, the Stuart has finally carved a path through the bocage in the middle of the village, allowing 4th Armoured Infantry Platoon to pass through, closely followed by most of the tanks of A Platoon. I want to keep these 2 units in the middle of Buron as a reserve. This is all good, but it's not necessarily going to help me tackle General's Panzers that much. Frontal engagements from inside the village are still unfavourable frontal engagements. What I really need is a flanking position to complement the Buron position. I need to create some right angles or L shapes so that if the Panzers present their thick frontal armour to one position, they expose their thinner side armour to the other. So 2 of A Platoon's tanks, A1 and A4, go off to the far right. There's a mostly enclosed field out there with some tall bocage to offer concealment, and it's just back from the crest of the ridge, so it also offers a good hull down position. The 2 tanks are just about getting to where I want them, as B Platoon's tanks are filtering into position in the far field in Buron. Then, some of the GIs in the far field spot an unbuttoned Panther, and decide to take some pot shots at the tank commander's head. Of course, they miss. The range is about 300 meters, but worse, they've given the far field position away. It was probably a bit optimistic to expect the Panzer Wedge to come even closer and expose its side armour to the Shermans as they lay in wait, but as long as it's facing Buron, its flanks are exposed to the 2 Shermans just arriving on the far right. One of the Jagdpanthers in particular is almost perfectly side on to a keyhole in the bocage, and I rush the 76 armed A1 forward to try and take advantage before General decides to put some distance between his tanks and Buron. Retaliating against the small arms fire, the Panzers immediately start blasting the hedgerow with high explosive. The target Jagdpanther fires an 88mm shell that slips through the bocage and hits a tree in the field. Cowering behind it are 2 men from a detached bazooka team who somehow survive with only light wounds. A1, meanwhile, rolls up to the keyhole and spots the Jagdpanther. It's hull down, a good 800 meters away, not an easy target, and the 76 misses high with its first shot. This sets off warning bells for both the Jagdpanther and a nearby Panther, who both start to rotate towards A1, but the Sherman gets a second shot off. This hits on the lower front hull, and it looks like it goes through the left drive wheel before pancaking on what I think is a torsion bar down in the suspension. The hit hasn't actually penetrated the hull, but it has caused some spalling, and this is scary enough for the crew that they bail out. A1 meanwhile hurriedly reverses while I put some intentional small arms fire on the adjacent Panther to try and button up the tank commander and make it harder to spot A1 before it can get away. Partly as another distraction from A1, and partly because there's a Panther moving onto the far right map edge that is side on, the 57mm anti-tank gun I've gotten into Buron opens up as well. This might be a bit optimistic. Panther is moving pretty fast and the range is about 800 meters. On the plus side, the 57mm AP shells are smaller and quicker to handle than the 75s or 76s in the Shermans, and the gunner isn't stuck inside a cramped turret where he doesn't have maximum room to maneuver, meaning that the little AT gun has a considerably faster rate of fire. The first shot goes low, but the windage is good. The gunner corrects his aim as the Panther turns a little, then nails it in the side of the turret. It's hard to tell what's going on in there after a visit from a 57mm AP shell, but with the turret rotating still and the Panther braking before reversing away, it's clearly still in action, so perhaps the post-penetration effect at this distance isn't that impressive. The AT gun has definitely given its position away though. One of the Wedge Panthers opens up on it with the bow machine gun almost as soon as it fires the first shot, following up with a 75mm high explosive round. The barrage is thick enough to shield the AT crew from the effects, and although they're quickly pinned, they do manage to get a third shot off. This one also connects, though it strikes the left edge of the gun mantlet and fails to penetrate. Hot on the heels of this engagement, as the AT team frantically drag their gun back away from the hedgerow to escape the hail of return fire, I've shifted one of the Shermans in the far field further up the hedgerow to make space for another, and at its last waypoint, it ends up in the barrage. I can't remember if this was some kind of pathfinding disaster or for some reason I thought it was a good idea. Maybe I was trying to get a flanking shot on the Panther penetrated by the AT gun, trying to finish it off. I certainly didn't reverse it away on the next turn, and the infantry open up on the Panzers to try and force the tank commanders to duck down, so I probably intended to do this. Most of the German tanks are area firing the AT gun's hedgerow, where it somehow gets away with a single man lightly wounded, so the Sherman, B3, actually goes unnoticed for quite some time. The General has his own plans here. The dismounted Jagdpanther crew are scrambling back into their tank destroyer, and the nearby Panther moves forward to support them. This Panther seems to spot B3, which is trying to rotate its hull to face the fields, and fires a shot. It's dead on, but somehow it bounces. Even the game seems a little confused about this, probably because of the interaction between the shell, the changing angles of the Sherman's armour as it rotates, and whatever effect the barrage is having. Whatever happened though, that is one lucky Sherman, and it takes that luck and runs with it. The Panzers apparently lose sight of it, leaving the crew free to engage their selected target. This is another Panther that was angled slightly off to engage the AT gun until B3 sprayed it with the Pintle 50. The German tank rotates to present its front slope, but apparently never makes the spot. B3's first shot is high, the second pancakes on the upper part of the gun mantlet, but the third smashes straight into the end of the Panther's gun barrel. This shot has undoubtedly ruined the muzzle brake and disables the gun, turning the tank into a 45-ton mobile machine gun bunker. Expecting any more here would be really pushing it. In the next turn, B3 reverses away, sharpish. The Panzer Wedge falls back too, just as A1 on the far right reoccupies its keyhole to try and get another flanking shot in. Of all the Panzers it could spot, it spots the Jagdpanther it hit the first time, just as it's swivelling in place, and fires a shot. It goes low, landing a little in front of the target. The range is still pretty long, again about 800 meters, and given the change in angle of the Jagdpanther, I don't think a connection would have actually achieved anything. The other Jagdpanther has made the spot though, and before A1 can get away, it puts an 88mm shell straight through the gun mantlet on the first try. That's the difference the high velocity makes. the flatter the trajectory, the less you have to mess around guessing the range. Only the driver gets out of the tank, which quickly starts the burn, wet stowage or not. The hit on A1 also kills a scout, wounds another and destroys their jeep. This is the scout team that's set up with the 57mm gun on the right during the initial rush. I just moved them up to help the Sherman spot and they were a little bit too close. They're not the only scouts that have a bad time this turn either. Over on the left, the team that got into San Contest is finally found by German infantry. I had intended to use these scouts as a forward listening post on that flank to give me some early warning if General decided to advance in that direction, although they ultimately ended up facing back to the west in order to get another angle on half-track corner. General knows that they're in San Contest somewhere, though he doesn't know how many of them there are or what they're armed with. Even an OP on the edge of the village, eyeballing the German reverse slope, would give me a huge advantage, so he has to check the area and route my troops out. This certainly works for me because it drags at least some enemy infantry and armour away from positions where they might support the panzer wedge or an attack on Buron. It does mean the scouts have a limited lifespan though, and they're soon rumbled by German infantry. They go down fighting. 3 M1 Garans and a Thompson at relatively short range is a decent amount of firepower in a small unit fight, but once German infantry get into the farmhouse next door, they take casualties, become pinned, and are inevitably mopped up. With the twin actions of A1 on the right being destroyed, and the scouts on the left being finished off, the battle quietens down for a few turns. The situation has solidified considerably. General has probed Buron with the panzer wedge and found it occupied, but cleared San Contest on his right. I've lost 2 Sherman 76s and a handful of scouts, but established a very strong position in the centre. I don't need to go anywhere. I've switched over to the defensive. That initial lunge into Buron is paying off immensely, putting the pressure to act on General. He basically has 2 options: attack Buron directly or bypass it, trying to find a dominant firing position or a weak point to exploit. Neither of these are very good options. Outside of the game environment, it would probably be sensible for the Germans to pull off or just avoid the village entirely at this stage and plough past to cut Buron off from support, but those aren't options in a quick battle and General isn't going to give up that easily. 25 minutes into the game, and 5 minutes after the panzer wedge fell back a little, it's back with all its friends. A total of 9 Panthers, 2 Jagdpanthers, and 3 Panzer IVs moves up to the main road on the far map edge. Not only is this even more armour at even greater range, but General has enough tanks to peel his way forward. Any tank that advances up the right flank might have to expose its side armour to Buron, but trying to take advantage of that when all the other tanks are looking my way is somewhat daunting. Worse, my supporting position on the far right is not going to be very useful until they get much closer. Currently, the panzers are masked behind the centre ridge, and while I could pop up the lone Sherman on the right over the crest to have a go, that's unlikely to end well. So the only anti-tank assets I have on hand to deal with this monster are the 4 remaining tanks of B platoon in the far field, 1 Sherman 76 and 3 Sherman 75s, plus the 57mm anti-tank gun further down. That might not sound a lot, but I have that huge advantage of fighting from a concealed position. I'm the one who's going to dictate the engagements here. And as the panzers move up, one of the Panthers is enticingly side-on to the AT gun. I'm not looking for some kind of dramatic, decisive firefight here because I'll lose that hands down. What I need to do is chip away at General's armour, and taking advantage of a good flanking shot to pick off one of the Panthers fits the bill. The 57 is likely to get spotted and engaged, but I can use that as a distraction to roll the Shermans forward and get some opportunistic shots in before retreating away. There's one little detail I've overlooked here though. That enticingly side-on Panther is the one that got hit on the muzzle brake earlier. Its main gun is out of action and it's not a threat. General is using it as bait. Blissfully unaware that I'm supposed to be shooting at that particular Panther, the AT gun opens up. The range is 744 meters, and the first shot is a little high, but it slams into the top edge of the commander's cupola and probably takes his head off. The crew bail out as a second shot goes through the side of the turret. The Shermans, meanwhile, have paused for 10 seconds at the start of the turn to give the 57 time to engage and attract attention, and now they roll up to the barrage. But only a single Panzer IV has actually spotted the AT gun and started to retaliate. Everything else is looking my way. Now things start to get complicated, so we're going to dive in on a tank by tank basis. On the left of the line is B Platoon's third tank, B3. This is the Lucky Sherman from earlier, and it still has a chunk missing where that 75mm shell bounced off. B3 is quickly spotted by a Panther on the left and bounces another shot on its frontal armour. The gunner is trying to get on target, but the driver is rotating the vehicle to try and get head on at the same time, forcing him to keep resetting. Then a second Panther fires. The angles are not in B3's favour this time, and the AP shell punches straight through the driver's position, killing him and totaling the tank. The rest of the crew panic and start to bail, but a third shell comes in through the gun mantlet and explodes inside the turret before they can escape. They all become casualties, and the Sherman starts to burn, having achieved nothing. Next up is the 76, B1. This gets the first shot of the engagement off, missing high over a head-on Panther. It then wisely switches to an easier target, putting a shell into the side of a Panzer IV, piercing a road wheel, and going through into the lower hull, where it probably finds either fuel or ammunition. The Panzer IV brews up immediately. This doesn't go unpunished. A nearby Panther has spotted B1 and smacks it in the front, causing a partial penetration on the outside of the driver's position. This damages the tracks, kills a nearby infantryman, and freaks the crew out a little, but they stay in the fight. A second incoming round dings off the front of the turret, just below the gunner's periscope. A third from one of the Jagdpanthers is thankfully intercepted by the barrage, and B1 manages to get a second shot off at another Panzer IV. The Panzer IV fires at almost the same time, and the shells pass each other in flight. The German shot skims over B1 a touch too high. B1's shot, on the other hand, goes in through the weapon mount, and at least totals the gun and kills the commander sitting directly behind it. Unsurprisingly rattled from tanking 3 hits, B1 is already popping smoke and reversing out of trouble as the turn ends. Only a few meters on from B1 is the platoon HQ tank, BHQ. This is armed with a 75, and perhaps because it's slightly further away from the Germans than the 2 tanks to its left, has a somewhat easier time. Moving into position, BHQ's first shot only just misses a head-on Panther, though if it was slightly quicker, it might have accidentally hit another Mark V transiting behind the target. BHQ switches to this moving but side-on Panther for its second shot, which only misses because the Panther slams on the brakes. Switching targets again, BHQ gets a third and final shot off just at the end of the turn, which blinks off the underside of a Jagdpanther's gun mount without penetrating. Finally, at the right end of the line, we have B4, the last 75. This engages one of the lead Panthers, offering a good side-on target, but misses high with its first shot. Luckily, B4 seems to escape notice and has time to correct its aim, getting a second shot off that barely just skims across the roof of the Panther's turret. One of the Panther IVs spots it at this point, but misses high. Then both B4 and the Panther IV fire their last shots of the turn simultaneously. The incoming round bounces not once, but twice, ricocheting off the lower front of B4's turret and then up off the top of the hull and sailing away into the orchard. B4, on the other hand, finally nails its target, hitting the Panther in the lower right side. The 75mm AP round punches through a road wheel, then into the lower hull. A little later, the crew bail out. All of these tank interactions took place at the same time, in the space of about 40 seconds, and were run by the Sherman's TAC AI. I didn't give them any target arcs or commands, they selected and engaged their own targets. At the start of the next turn, The 3 surviving, rather nervous Shermans reverse away from the hedgerow and close the engagement. At the expense of 1 Sherman 75 and an unlucky GI in the wrong place at the wrong time, I've knocked out 2 Panzer IVs, a Panther with an inoperable main gun, and forced the crew of a 2nd Panther to bail. It's not clear if they're going to be able to recrew their vehicle. That's a result I'll certainly take, but there are definitely things I can improve for the next engagement. In particular, I screwed up the orders for the Shermans. The plan was to drive up to the Bocage, pause for 30 seconds to engage, and then pull back. Without really thinking about it, I ordered them up to the hedgerow with a hunt command, meaning as soon as they saw the enemy, they stopped and cancelled all further orders, leaving them in the line of fire for longer than I intended. Although this paid off to some extent, the Shermans were generally able to get 3 shots out instead of just 2, the speed, volume and accuracy of the German gunnery coming back was intimidating as hell. I get the distinct impression that only the range and the Bocage saved me from much greater losses. While this armour engagement has been going on, I've also been thinking about my left flank. It's not completely out of the question that General's trying to draw my attention over to the right with his armour so that he has a cleaner run-in on the left. I know he has some infantry in and around Saint-Contest. Apart from the shootout with the scouts, one of 2nd Platoon's half-tracks with a slight height advantage spotted German soldiers in the field across the way and engaged them with the 50. Plus, the distance across the choke point between Saint-Contest and Buron is probably the shortest space to attempt an attack over. That said, 2nd Platoon is in a very strong position, and I think it's got a good chance of holding out against any attack until I can bring forces in from the centre of Buron to back them up. The Shermans of C Platoon, though, who have been set up to watch the left flank since the beginning of the game, are going to be more useful elsewhere. One of the 75s, C3, is up by half-track corner, and it's worth leaving that there, along with the Platoon HQ, which is tucked away in a defilated reverse slope position where it can cover the left-hand gap if need be. I'm starting to move the other 3 tanks off, though. C1, the first 76, relocates into the centre of Buron as a reserve that can fall back to the left or reinforce the far field as necessary, while the second 76, C2, and the last 75, C4, shuffle into the centre and then across to the right to bolster the outer position, staying down below the crest line as they go. There's also another 57mm AT gun that was set up to cover the left, but I'm limbering it up and sending it off to the far field where I think it's going to be a lot more useful, along with the remaining 76 from A Platoon, A2. I do feel like I'm not shooting enough stuff over on the left though. There aren't a lot of targets around, but from that position a couple of my GIs can just about see 2 of General's flak wagons in the distance. It's a long way, but they are juicy targets, especially seen as though I have an FO in the process of directing the P-47s back onto the Panzers out on the right flank. After the impressive show put up by the flak at the beginning, anything I can do to attrite or suppress it has got to be a good idea. I don't really have anything that can reach out and touch them though. C3 can't get line of sight from where it is because of the Bocage. It would be able to see from the wooded field next door, but there isn't a path through. The Stuarts accumulated enough track damage to become immobilised breaking into the far right field, so that's not an option. And while the scouts from the recon platoon carry demo charges that can blast through Bocage and open a path, I don't rate the chances of the team on the left if they leave their anti-tank ditch and expose themselves to the Germans in Saint-Contest. With another team hiding in the wheat distressingly close to the Panzers, which I'm not going to move, the only available team is the one on the far right, whose jeep was destroyed. I have sent another jeep to go and get them, but that'll take a while, and in the meantime I'm able to content myself by engaging the flak with 2nd Platoon's 60mm mortar. The flak wagons are just at the edge of the 60mm mortar's 1820 metre range, so I can reach out and touch them, but the bombs really need a good direct hit to knock one out, and they just don't get lucky. Meanwhile, the Panzers are back on the move. General is carefully peeling them forward, keeping the maximum number of tanks facing my positions in a way that really doesn't make me want to open fire. There are a few incidents though. The 57 on the right apparently gets bored just watching the enemy and decides to open up despite its target arc. It's a good shot though, pinging off the barrel of the remaining Panzer IV and undoubtedly rendering the main gun inoperable. The 57 crew scurry back from the barrage as another volley of area fire comes their way in retaliation, and again, they somehow get away with it. They could do with sharing some of their luck though. The 76 on standby in the village centre, C1, suddenly gets a 75mm AP shell to the face, courtesy of a Panther that has gotten far enough forward to somehow make the spot and successfully engage through an orchard, through a keyhole between two buildings, and over a high wall. This is probably a combination of bad luck and neglecting that all-important attention to detail. Little mistakes like this add up. I've now lost half of my Sherman 76s. There is a ray of sunshine though. The planes are back. Swooping in, they mercilessly strafe the Panzers. Just like before, they're not going to outright destroy any Panthers or Jagdpanthers, though the remaining Panzer IV might be feeling pretty nervous right now, but they are going to strip off radio aerials, crack periscopes, damage tracks, and force tank commanders to button up. This cumulative damage, along with the damage from Sherman hits, even those that don't penetrate, is adding up and degrading the Panzer's ability to spot and communicate. Better yet, the P-47s are getting away with it. There is still flak going up, but all the AA fire seems to be struggling at this greater range. General responds by hammering Buron with high explosive. There's a real danger he might take out my forward observers here, but the Germans have a lot of positions to cover and they're well concealed, so I'm able to get away with it. Over in the far field, BHQ tanks a stray 75mm high explosive shell that makes it through the hedgerow, damaging the tracks and inflicting some subsystem degradation back, but it's otherwise okay. Over on the left, while all this is going on, things are very quiet. The scouts have arrived and blown a path for Sherman C3 to get forward and take some potshots at the flak, and it actually manages to score a hit at 1,900 meters, an incredible shot, lucky or otherwise. It is just the high explosive shell though, and although some of the crew are wiped out, the flak wagon is able to carry on. Overall, the situation is gradually developing. Although General is still moving down the right flank and I'm still in Buron, the Panzers are becoming less of a threat over time as battle damage builds up, while I'm being able to bring fresh Shermans up to the far field and get more into position further down in Buron and out on the far right. As the German armour starts to string out a little bit, it's time to start another engagement. The plan is a little different this time. The 57mm gun up in the far field will kick things off, with the tanks and the first 57mm coming into action a few seconds later as they move up to the hedgerow. So it's an AT gun that starts proceedings. There's a Panther presenting its side armour about 650 metres out. The 57mm misses with its first shot, which is short and wide, and immediately attracts the attention of another Panther. This gets a round off just as the AT gun reloads, lightly wounding the gun team leader, but the gunner gets his shot away. This is a good hit, a penetration on the right upper hull. The Panther is still going, it pops smoke and reverses away, but the crew are unlikely to be happy with the hole suddenly appearing in their tank. The 57mm gun crew adopts the fetal position to escape more incoming fire. There's some inherent risk to the AT gun here, but the focusing of the Panzer's TAC AI should pay off, distracting them at the critical moment as the Shermans go into action. Except they don't. I've marginally screwed up the orders again. They don't go quite far enough forward to see through the barrage and happily sit out their pause command before reversing back again. The 57mm gun, meanwhile, takes another two 75mm high explosive hits from the Panthers, one of which knocks out the gun. That's obviously not ideal, but they haven't taken any more casualties, so I'll take it. To add insult to injury here, one of the Panthers has gotten far enough forward to spot and engage the immobilised Stuart with the hedge cutter, which has absolutely no chance. Honestly, I'd completely forgotten about it and really should have bailed the crew out and stashed them somewhere safe instead of leaving them to get cooked. That little 37mm gun was never going to contribute from that position. Somewhat annoyed with myself, I throw the Shermans forward on the next turn, and once again, things get complicated. There are 4 tanks in the far field again. From left to right, we have A1, the surviving A Platoon 76, B Platoon HQ, B2, the B Platoon 76, and B4, which is a standard Sherman 75. The engagement is actually well timed. General is coincidentally making a serious move forward up onto the crest of the central ridge at the same time that my tanks go into action. A1 rolls up and gets its first shot off against the Panther that is just in the process of rotating to show its weaker side armour. The 76mm AP round only just misses, barely skimming over the Panther's cupola. A1 then switches to one of the Jagdpanthers, which is also side on, but again aims ever so slightly too high and skims the top. Then a Panther scores a hit on the front of the turret, killing the tank commander and the radio operator down in the hull. A1 pops smoke, drops into a shaken state, and reverses so hard it knocks down the low wall behind it. Next in line to the right, BHQ first spots and engages the transiting Jagdpanther. The platoon leader hammers it with the pintle mounted 50, but like A1, the first main gun round goes just high. A Panther immediately spots BHQ and fires a round that is intercepted by the tree it's hiding behind. The Sherman gets a second shot off at the Jagdpanther and again misses high. Then the Panther, targeting it, fires a second shot. This one is not stopped by convenient foliage and scores a partial penetration on BHQ's weapon mount, in between the 75mm gun and the coax. This probably flings bits of both weapons into the loader, rendering him lightly wounded and both weapons inoperable. The crew prevaricate in shock for a few vital seconds, then start popping smoke and trying to reverse away, but the offending Panther has had time to reload and gets a third round off. This one fully penetrates the weapon mount for the 75, totaling the turret and finishing off the loader. The crew go into a panic and bail out, their tank destroyed. B2, the other 76, meanwhile, has a somewhat more successful experience. It first decides to engage one of the Panthers moving up the slope on the right, though it misses low, which I guess is at least a change to missing high. It then suffers a hit from a 75mm AP shell on the lower front hull. Luckily this fails to penetrate, but it does cause some spalling that damages the tracks and kills the leader of 3rd Armoured Infantry Platoon, who is unfortunate enough to be right next to the tank. Although somewhat upset by having to share their tank with a shower of red-hot metal fragments, the crew of B1 stay in the fight, switching onto the transiting Jagdpanther for their second shot. This is a solid hit, a full penetration up in the rear of the Jagdpanther's casemate. The huge tank destroyer immediately stops and starts to burn. B1 doesn't have time to celebrate though. Another AP round zips in and takes out the pintle mounted 50. That is far too close, it's definitely time to go, and B1 beats a hasty retreat. Last up in the far field is B4, which interestingly makes the same targeting decisions as B2, but it's slightly slow off the mark. It goes for the same Panther on the right first, and it's on target, scoring a penetration that prompts the crew to bail. Then it targets the Jagdpanther. I'm not 100% sure what actually happens here, because the hit text from B1's successful penetration overrides the hit that B4 achieves, but it looks like this 75mm AP shot is a touch low, punching through both sets of road wheels, missing the lower hull, and ending up in the wheat behind the Jagdpanther. Regardless, B4 is the only Sherman in the far field to get away without suffering any return fire, and it reverses back without even a mark on the paint. All in all, that wasn't the best engagement ever. I'll take knocking out a Jagdpanther and forcing a Panther crew to bail any day, but in exchange for losing one Sherman entirely, having one take significant damage with 2 killed, plus having a third take more damage is not a rate of attrition I can really sustain. But I might not have to worry too much about the far field anymore. General's lunge forward up the slope has brought my right flank position back into play. As the lead Panther looms over the crest, the 2 Sherman 75s in the right field, A3 and C4, lay into it with everything they've got. 50 caliber M2s, the 75mm main gun, and even the bow MGs are lighted up with a hail of fire from the reverse slope. A3 even manages to bounce a shot off the underside of the gun mantlet into the top of the hull, though aggravatingly it doesn't penetrate. The Panther reacts, the TC cool as anything, as he casually ignores all the incoming machine gun fire, swings the turret around, and fires a shot that skims over C4's turret. It doesn't get to fire another though. This is the Panther that gets penetrated in the side by B4. As the crew bail, the 275s continue to batter the front of the turret with main gun rounds. After all, a tank is still a tank until it's on fire. C4 switches onto a second Panther that comes up but doesn't get a main gun round off. Further down the reverse slope, back in the hedgerow with the 57mm AT gun I set up right at the beginning of the game, is C2, one of the Sherman 76s. This spots the same second Panther, but only manages an undershoot into some wreckage and an overshoot before the turn ends. Unlike with the far field, I can't disengage over here by hiding behind some hedgerows. As long as General is pushing that crest, then there's going to be a fight. The Panzers keep the pressure up on the next turn, even as I try and scrape some extra safety for A3 and C4 by reversing them down the slope a little. A third Panther pushes forward, spraying C4 with its bow machine gun. The 275s return fire, bouncing a few shots off its turret face, but score no penetrations. The Panther never fires its main gun, and it must have had line of sight to do so if the bow gunner is in play. Closer examination reveals that there's already a penetration in the side of this Panther's turret. Judging from the location, that hit may well have knocked out the main gun. The second Panther advances too, though it looks like the Panther 4 ahead of it gets in its way a few times. The delay gives C2 the opportunity to get its eye in, missing only one more time before it bounces a 76mm shell off the front of the turret. The Panther swings its turret round to engage, just as a second shot from C2 bounces off the top of the gun mantlet, then it takes a penetration to the right of the hull. Down in Buron, the A platoon HQ tank has moved up to the edge of the field where I was holding it in reserve, to a perfect keyhole position looking into the flank of any German push up to the crest. It's taken one shot to get its eye in, but now AHQ is on target and sends out another 75mm AP round that enters the side of the turret well forward. The Panther is already reversing away, helped on by another bounce from C2, but although it's still going, a penetration in that spot on the turret does not bode well for the Panther's main armament. There are two more Panthers coming up, but these are engaged by the 57mm AT gun. Finally in position again, having already bounced around off the front of the remaining Jagdpanther to absolutely zero effect, the AT gun switches onto the flank of one of the advancing Panthers and puts a shot straight through the side of the turret. That was far better a result than I could ever have hoped for, but a two-turn extended engagement is not really something I want to be going for against the Panzers. What elements I can draw back, move to disengage. Tank A4, also having moved from the reserve field in the centre, is in a défilé position to maintain the L shape covering the crest if General persists, but the game is up. The push down the far right was always the least worst of two bad options, and still arguably preferable to trying to storm Buron directly, but the cumulative losses and damage to the Panzers has gotten to the point where they're close to being a spent force. With one final hurrah from two Panzer IVs back on the left, one of which is knocked out by Tank C3 from its position in the field by half-track corner, the game ends. General has hit the surrender button, so I win by default, but with all the ground objectives under my control, that was probably how it was going to pan out anyway. In terms of casualties, the results are actually quite similar. I've lost 21 dead and 15 wounded, while General has lost 44 and 20 respectively. The difference there is almost certainly the fight up at half-track corner early on, where the dismounting Germans came off worse. Beyond that, I've lost 7 tanks, 3 jeeps and 2 P-47s, compared to General's loss of 5 tanks, a half-track, one of the flak wagons, which was finally nailed at ridiculous range by C3, and 2 Kubelwagens. This doesn't tell the whole story though. I might have only knocked out 5 German tanks, 2 Panzer IVs, 2 Panthers and a Jagdpanther, but of the 11 Panzers left, 2 have been abandoned by their crews, 2 more have had their main guns disabled, another 2 have had their optics and radios stripped away, and a final pair has suffered various states of subsystem damage but can carry on. Only 3 are in perfect condition, the surviving Panther IV on the left and 2 of the Panthers on the right, though one of those has a wounded commander. By comparison, although I've lost more tanks outright, I've only got 2 that are heavily damaged, leaving the remaining 8 in perfect or almost perfect condition. This is somewhat a reflection of the technical mismatches between the heavier German tanks and American armour. A Panther might accumulate damage as its armour protects it from being knocked out, while a Sherman is lucky to survive getting hit at all. But it's a better indication of the strength of my position in Buron and the advantages of being able to fight defensively. Being able to dictate the tank fight was crucial. I was able to decide when engagements began and when they ended, without revealing my whole strength or positions. General, on the other hand, was out in the open where I could watch his every move and get a good idea of what I was up against. It all comes down to that initial rush for position in the first few turns, which the Allies were able to easily win. I had forces up at the far end of Buron just as General was entering on his near side. This is somewhat to do with just throwing the map together and not putting too much thought into the balance. In hindsight, the road network, especially the long straight road up the far left, and the relative distances from deployment zones to Buron gave the Allies a significant advantage. If the starting sides had been swapped, the initial contacts could easily have taken place in the middle of the village, which may have led to a more balanced fight. Something else that should have been different was the objective locations. I put all of these in Buron, which compounded the Allied speed advantage. It would have been better to spread them out, perhaps leaving the major objective in Buron, and then moving the 2 minor objectives into Grouchy and Saint-Contest respectively. This way, if one side was able to seize the 200 points in the centre, the other could equalise this by holding their home village and bypassing Buron to seize the other. Regardless, this was still a very good game. A massive hats off to General Sir Anthony for carrying on after those first few turns when it became apparent how the game was likely to pan out. We got a very interesting and tense armour battle out of that decision, though I suspect I'm going to receive a good kicking the next time we play. Hope you all enjoyed this absolute monster of a video, and I'll see you in the next one.